over the weekend, the ANC Secretary-General Fikile Mbalula said he disagreed with the comment by former President Thabo Mbeki that while the ANC had promised to renew itself in 2017 and again last year, nothing had been done. Mbeki said the ANC had failed in its promise to change after the period of state capture. He also said the private sector and civil society groups were essentially taking over important roles in the country. He went on to say capital and civil society won't help the majority of our people. And Mbalula says the ANC has taken major decisions about renewal and is moving in the right direction. Professor Dirk Kotze is a professor of political science at UNISA. Professor Kotze, good afternoon to you. It's been really interesting to watch the former President Thabo Mbeki, quiet for a long time, suddenly in the last couple of years making a series of public comments about the organization that he used to lead. Why do you think he's being so vocal?
Well, I think, first of all, it realizes that the ANC has declined in terms of especially electoral support very significantly. Also, at the same time, in terms of public opinion, the ANC is criticized by about everyone nowadays. So the moral standing of the ANC, the moral claim of the ANC as a liberation organization is under pressure, actually, because the fact that it is not delivering in the eyes of the public in general what they were expecting from the ANC means that the mandate that they have, the historical mandate that they have, they are not complying with it. They are not dealing with that in the same way and distinguishing them from other political parties. In the past, the ANC always had the upper hand in relation to other parties, opposition parties, because they say we were the only liberation movement and the others are simply political parties who come and go. But we are there for more than 100 years already. Now that status, that moral claim that the ANC has is under pressure because of the public opinion that has turned a lot against the ANC. And especially, as we know, with next year's election, the future of the ANC is uncertain. And I think for someone like President Mbeki, that's just unthinkable that they've reached this point.
It's interesting because, there's a lot that people criticize Mbeki for. Of course, HIV views, which he hasn't changed, is one of them. But on this, it seems to me, he's actually been fairly consistent because back in 2007, in his address, his political report to the ANC conference, he lost that conference, of course. He talked about people engaging in criminal and immoral activities driven by the hunger for personal gain. And then he went back to 1997, and he quoted Nelson Mandela himself from his address to the ANC conference back then, saying that there'd been careerism within their ranks. People were working towards their own individual gratification. 1997 was a long time ago, Professor. There's a lot of consistency here from Mbeki.
Yes, that is indeed so. And he's not the only person. Someone else who has done that, especially as Secretary General, is Kgalema Motlanthe. During his time, and that was also the early 2000s, he said exactly the same in his organizational reports. So there were lots of warning within the ANC, not from outside necessarily, but within the ANC, about organizational problems, of the way in which branches were functioning, the way in which there was careerism, sort of self-interest that became the main focus. So the ANC has been aware of it and has heard it from the top echelons of their leadership, right from a very early stage. And I think this is the fact that they've reached this point is possibly the frustration for President Mbeki that very little has happened in order to turn that around. And it has, in a sense, reached now the point where President Ramaphosa during his term is talking about renewal. But that is the main point that he raised at the commemoration of Aziz Part was exactly that this renewal so far hasn't produced very much.
So the issue of renewal, as you say, the President Cyril Ramaphosa has spoken about it many times. He's repeated the claim. Obviously, there was an important moment, I think 2 years ago now, on the step-aside resolution. Anyone implicated, anyone charged with corruption has to step aside. That was a big moment. I don't know, do you think voters believe the ANC is really renewing itself?
I don't think the voters believe that, because the voters just judge the ANC not so much on its organizational health or to what extent organizationally they have restructured themselves or changed their membership systems or change the way in which they are going to nominate now new candidates for next year. But it is about the output. It's about the delivery side. It is about governance. It's about what the ANC produce for society in general. And I think this is where the judgment is so harsh for the ANC at this point in time, that they are saying, well, whether it is about water, whether it's about electricity, whether it's about the railways, these systems, these infrastructural systems, the services are simply not working. And on the basis of that, the ANC is judged, not on its role as a political party and its internal procedures and its internal structures, and whether there's integrity commission and those type of things.
So, okay, we have all of this criticism from the ANC now from a former leader who has really repeated, I suppose you could say, a consistent position. And yet, Professor, one of the great questions of our politics is that the ANC is still at least twice as big as the next political party, and no one seems to be taking their votes.
Well, I think this is the mysterious part of South African politics, and party politics specifically, is that the ANC has lost votes from almost having 70% to where they are now at 57%, and at local government level already below the 50%. But there's no new party emerging. The DA to a large extent is stuck around about 20%, somewhere in the 20s. The EFF is stuck around about 10%. The RFP is stuck around about 5%. But there's no sort of emerging group, political formation, political party that really picks up this, what the ANC is losing. So the only way in which we can actually explain this at the moment is that those who are moving away from the ANC don't go to any other party. They just become apathetic. They withdraw from politics to a large extent. That applies obviously in the first instance to the youth.
Can we sometimes forget what was maybe the great achievement of the ANC from perhaps the 1940s onwards? To my mind, at least, if you consider the history of South Africa as a nation state, let's call it the beginning in 1910, the ANC has really been the only political party to draw support from all parts of our society. No one else has ever come close to doing that.
Yes, that is, and I think you refer specifically to the 1950s with the so-called Congress Alliance and the formation, the adoption of the Freedom Charter at the Congress of the People, ironically Cope's name. But that was, I think, the high point for the ANC in terms of this. Thereafter followed in the 1980s, obviously, the United Democratic Front, which took it further than that. And they became really very much of a multi-racial or multinational or non-racial organization, and very inclusive, not only of political parties, but also civil society organizations, trade unions, civic organizations, and many others, more than 600 of them. So that I would say can be regarded as the high points of the ANC and its affiliated and its organizations like the UDF in terms of mobilizing popular support. But thereafter, and then in terms of electoral votes, up to around about 2004, the ANC was highly successful with that. But thereafter it started to go down.
It would seem so obvious, and I realize this is a simplistic question, but it would seem so obvious that if the ANC is at the risk of losing elections, the obvious thing to do is to get rid of people who are perceived by voters as being corrupt. And yet it's not doing that. I mean, we had people, elected back into the ANC's NEC in December, people like Mduduzi Manana, for example. I mean, there are plenty of other examples. William Kise was a challenger for the leadership despite the Digital Vibe scandal. He hasn't been formally charged, but there seems to be strong evidence against him. What I'm trying to get to is, I suppose it's a much bigger question, Professor Kotze. Why can't the ANC renew itself? If that's what it knows, it has to promise voters.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. And I'm not sure that the ANC will answer that themselves also. I think what it boils down to is that these persons that you've mentioned have over time developed some constituencies within their immediate environment, whether it is in the Youth League when they were there. Persons like Fikile Mbalula still have some links with the Youth League, the same with other former members of the Youth League. The same with persons who have very strong constituencies in their provinces or even in their towns or cities. And I think the ANC believes that is that's a constituency that's there forever. They don't lose that when persons start to become involved in maladministration or corruption or even being sentenced to jail. Take someone like Tony Yangeni, he remains quite popular in the Western Cape. So I think that is the dilemma for the ANC is that the sense of renewal in terms of bringing in new generations is actually very difficult for them. I think what is also part of it is that the ANC, and especially the older generation, believes that they are necessary there in order to maintain the legacy and the history of the ANC from the earlier years, especially during the exile period. And that the youngsters who are coming in are there for more pragmatic and maybe even opportunistic reasons. And they are like the guardians of the ANC's legacy and its values. And that therefore they need to be there, despite the way in which they conduct themselves. So I think this is the catch-22 situation for the ANC, why they cannot sort of renew themselves in a generational sense, so that young persons can become the next generation of leaders there.
Professor Dirk Kotze, thank you. Professor of Political Science at UNISA, really do appreciate the time. Well, a reminder